We are often told that a strong leader is one who takes a hard line in trade negotiations, who demands more and concedes less, who treats every discussion like a battle to be won. It's an attractive story because it gives the illusion of control and dominance. But the truth is, in the realm of international trade, this kind of thinking is dangerously simplistic. A trade war, no matter how it is packaged, is not a test of muscle, it is a test of endurance, trust, and long-term vision. And when that vision is sacrificed for short-term optics, the damage begins quietly, invisibly, and often irreversibly. Consider the idea of imposing heavy tariffs as a show of strength. On the surface, it seems like a statement, we will protect our industries and the other side will bend. But trade is not a zero-sum game. It's an intricate ecosystem where every barrier you raise disturbs not just the target, but your own foundation. You can slow another nation's exports, but you also slow your own imports, your own production, your own innovation. The victory you celebrate at the podium is often the beginning of a silent recession in boardrooms and factory floors. There's also a deep psychological trap here. Power in negotiations comes not from fear, but from mutual respect and mutual need. When you posture as the aggressor, you force your counterpart to dig in, to protect their pride, to seek alliances elsewhere. India, in this case, did exactly that. Confronted with hostility, it didn't crumble. It adapted, redirected trade, and sought alternative partnerships. In doing so, it learned how to live without the very market the US was trying to use as leverage. And that lesson will stay with them far longer than any single administration's term. Economies are built on trust the way bridges are built on steel. Remove enough of it, and the entire structure becomes unsafe to cross. What's tragic is that this erosion often happens without dramatic headlines. Supply contracts quietly expire, joint ventures quietly stall, investors quietly shift funds to safer, more predictable environments. The collapse isn't a loud explosion. It's the sound of doors closing one by one until the room is empty. The illusion of strength in trade wars is seductive because it plays to our instincts for competition, for winning. But global economics is not a boxing match. It's a symphony. You can't win by silencing half the instruments. You only diminish the music for everyone. The real measure of strength is not how hard you can hit, but how well you can keep the orchestra playing in harmony. And if we forget that, we may find that by the time we declare victory, there's nothing left worth winning. Would you like me to now move on to key point 2 so the flow between them stays seamless? When policies turn hostile, they rarely remain contained to the immediate context in which they're deployed. Tariffs, threats, and public insults may be aimed at a specific negotiation table, but their effects radiate far beyond that moment. Economies are not isolated rooms, they are intricate networks of trust, expectation, and flow. A single aggressive act can trigger a cascade, what I call the domino effect of policy hostility, where one disruption leads to another, until the initial intent is almost irrelevant compared to the chaos it has set in motion. In the case of Trump's hardline stance toward India, the tariffs and sharp rhetoric weren't just messages to New Delhi, they were signals to the entire world about the US approach to partnerships. Investors are not immune to those signals. When they sense volatility, they retreat. Capital that might have fueled innovation, infrastructure, or expansion is instead parked in safer markets. Businesses, too, begin adjusting their strategies, not because they are patriotic or disloyal, but because uncertainty is expensive. A company that relies on imports or exports doesn't simply wait and see. It diversifies, moves operations, or cuts back entirely. The most insidious part of this chain reaction is that it doesn't need direct confrontation to cause damage. Supply chains are living systems, they adapt to survive. When the US raised tariffs, Indian exporters didn't simply absorb the hit. They began looking to other markets, deepening ties with countries more predictable in their trade commitments. At the same time, American companies that had built relationships in India started reconsidering whether those channels were worth the political and economic turbulence. And in that revaluation, many quietly withdrew. Policy hostility is like introducing a toxin into a river. You may have intended to target one fish, but the entire ecosystem begins to change. The water becomes less hospitable, species migrate. The balance that once sustained life is altered in ways that cannot be easily reversed. And just like in nature, the longer the toxin remains, the more permanent the shift becomes. There's also a human dimension to this. Trade is not just the exchange of goods, it is the exchange of trust, reliability, and reputation. Once a nation is perceived as unpredictable or combative, every future negotiation begins with an invisible surcharge of skepticism. Even if the hostility is temporary, the memory of it lingers, coloring every deal, every handshake, every promise. And here lies the paradox: the very policies designed to strengthen national leverage can, over time, weaken it. Because the world is watching, and in the global marketplace, no country stands alone for long. A trade war may begin as a calculated strategy, but once the dominoes start falling, it often becomes something else entirely, a self-inflicted isolation. In the end, we have to remember that the real cost of hostility is not measured in tariffs collected or contracts lost. It is measured in the trust that evaporates, the partnerships that fade, and the opportunities that will never again knock on the same door. Emerging economies like India occupy a unique and often precarious position in the global market. They are not fragile in the sense of being weak. India's growth over the last decades proves otherwise, but they are vulnerable to external shocks in ways that more mature economies are not. Much of their momentum depends on the stability of foreign partnerships, on the predictability of access to export markets, and on the flow of investment that trusts the ground it's building on will not shift overnight. When those assurances are shaken, the consequences can be swift and far-reaching. India's relationship with the United States was, for years, a cornerstone of its economic aspirations. Technology collaborations, pharmaceutical exports, manufacturing deals, all of these relied not just on favorable numbers but on the mutual belief that the partnership was strategic, stable, and growing. A sudden shift to a harsher, more combative trade posture didn't simply raise costs, it disrupted the mental framework that sustained those relationships. Investors in Mumbai and New York alike began to factor in the possibility that this bridge could be closed at any moment. For an emerging market, perception often matters as much as reality. If a partner nation signals unpredictability, companies don't wait for a crisis. They plan as though it has already arrived. Contracts are written with exit clauses, new projects are delayed, and in the silence of those delays, competitors move in. China, for example, has long understood the importance of filling vacuums in global trade. When India's ties with the US became strained, China didn't need to launch a grand strategy. It simply stepped into the space that had been created, offering alternative markets, financing, and supply chain links. This is the fragility I'm talking about, not weakness, but exposure. An emerging economy is like a climber scaling a steep mountain with the help of ropes anchored to stronger peaks. Cut one of those ropes, and the climber doesn't necessarily fall immediately, but the margin for error shrinks dramatically. Every gust of wind, every slip, becomes more dangerous. And if too many ropes are cut, the climb can halt altogether. The tragedy is that these breaks in partnership are often driven by political narratives that value short-term appearances over long-term strategy. Toughness may play well on the campaign trail, but in the ledger books of real economies, it can dismantle years of careful progress in weeks. And when trust is lost, rebuilding it takes far longer than the time it took to destroy it. In the modern world, strength is not the absence of vulnerability, it is the ability to recognize it and protect it. If we ignore the delicate interdependence of rising economies and established powers, we will keep repeating the same mistake, trading enduring partnerships for temporary headlines, and discovering too late that in the process, we've empowered our rivals more than ourselves. Trust is the invisible currency of global trade. It doesn't show up in balance sheets, it can't be taxed, and it doesn't fluctuate with the exchange rate, yet it determines the flow of trillions of dollars. When trust is present, deals move faster, investments grow bolder, and negotiations feel less like battles and more like shared ventures. But when trust is broken, the damage is often deeper than any tariff or sanction could inflict, because it reaches into the psychology of how nations, businesses, and people decide to engage with one another. The collapse of US-India trade relations wasn't just about economics. It was about the rupture of a belief, the belief that both sides were committed to a predictable, mutually beneficial path. Once that belief cracked, everything else began to shift. Contracts that had once been rubber-stamped now required exhaustive legal review. Executives who once traveled freely to finalize deals began asking, will this still be worth it in a year? The optimism that fuels innovation and expansion was replaced by hesitation. In diplomacy, as in personal relationships, trust is cumulative. It builds over years of kept promises, consistent behavior, and mutual respect. And when it breaks, it doesn't just go back to zero, it goes into the negative. That's the psychological cost people underestimate. Even if a new administration takes a softer stance, the memory of the previous hostility lingers. Partners wonder if history will repeat itself, if the goodwill being offered today is just a temporary performance. This is where the philosophical dimension becomes clear. Trust is not a luxury in global affairs, it's a strategic asset. To treat it as expendable is to misunderstand the very foundation of long-term influence. A country's power is not measured solely by the size of its military or the strength of its currency, but by how many doors remain open to it without having to be forced. Every act of hostility may win a momentary concession, but it also quietly closes a door somewhere else. In the US-India case, the erosion of trust had consequences beyond trade statistics. It shaped how India viewed future alliances, how it prioritized diplomatic outreach, and how willing it was to align with American positions in broader geopolitical matters. And these shifts are not easily reversed. You can renegotiate tariffs, you can reopen markets, but you can't legislate away the doubt in someone's mind once they've felt betrayed. The lesson here is painfully simple. Economic policy is not just about numbers, it's about relationships. And relationships, whether between individuals or nations, cannot thrive in an atmosphere of suspicion. We may think we can rebuild trust whenever we choose, but in reality, every broken commitment leaves a scar. If we treat trust carelessly, we will wake up one day to find that the world still trades, but increasingly, it trades without us. One of the greatest misconceptions about aggressive trade policies is that their consequences are one-sided, that the damage falls squarely on the other nation. While the initiator remains insulated, in reality the blow almost always lands on both sides, and sometimes the initiator bleeds more quietly, but more deeply. The US-India trade collapse is a perfect example of this dynamic. It wasn't just India that felt the sting of tariffs and severed agreements. The impact rippled right back into the American economy, touching industries, communities, and consumers in ways that often went unnoticed in the headlines. When tariffs go up, they don't only make imported goods more expensive for the target country, they make them more expensive for your own citizens. That means higher prices on store shelves, from electronics to textiles to pharmaceuticals. And while the political narrative might frame those costs as a necessary sacrifice for national strength, the truth is that these costs rarely fall on the policymakers who set the strategy. They fall on working families, on small businesses, and on farmers trying to move their crops into competitive markets. For American exporters, India was not just a distant partner, it was a growing market with rising consumer demand. The moment that relationships soared, those exporters faced closed doors, reduced orders, and shrinking margins. A soybean farmer in Iowa or a machinery manufacturer in Ohio might never be mentioned in a policy speech about winning a trade dispute, but they are the ones who feel the loss most directly. Their livelihoods are not abstract statistics, they are day-to-day realities shaped by whether a shipment clears customs or sits in a port gathering dust. And beyond the measurable cost, there is a slower, more corrosive effect, the loss of momentum. Trade is not just about the goods that move today, it's about the relationships that will decide who gets tomorrow's contracts. When the US made India a less certain partner, American businesses didn't just lose current deals, they lost their seat at the table for future ones. Competitors from Europe, Southeast Asia, and, of course, China moved in to claim that space. Once those supply chains are established, they don't come back easily. This is the paradox of the harsh stance. It's sold as a tool to strengthen the domestic economy, but it can end up weakening the very sectors it was meant to protect. The fallout is rarely dramatic enough to make the evening news. It happens gradually, in reduced sales figures, in cautious investment strategies, in opportunities quietly handed to someone else. The hard truth is that economic aggression is never contained. It is a boomerang. You can throw it with all the force you want, but sooner or later, it comes back in your direction. And when it does, it doesn't care about political slogans. It hits whoever happens to be standing in its path. Rebuilding after an economic collapse is far more difficult than preventing it in the first place. It's a truth every negotiator knows, but few leaders seem willing to internalize. Once a trade relationship is fractured, once trust has been damaged, supply chains disrupted, and alternative partnerships formed, you're no longer working with the same starting point you had before. You're dealing with a new reality, one in which the other side has learned to live without you, and perhaps even to thrive in your absence. That's why the road back from collapse is steep, slow, and often humbling. For the United States and India, repairing the bridge means more than removing tariffs or signing a new agreement. It requires acknowledging the psychological wounds left by the breakdown. India will not simply forget the abrupt shift from strategic partner to economic adversary, nor will American industries quickly erase the caution they now feel about depending on Indian markets. These feelings, though intangible, shape the very decisions that drive trade, whether to invest, whether to expand, whether to commit to a decades-long partnership. The first step on that road back is a recognition that negotiation is not an exercise in domination. It's a process of aligning interests in a way that leaves both sides feeling respected. This requires patience, humility, and a willingness to concede in areas where mutual benefit is greater than unilateral gain. It means shifting from a posture of what can we extract, to one of what can we build together. That kind of reframing is not just good economics, it's good psychology. The second step is consistency. Nations remember patterns. If your trade policies swing wildly with each election cycle, no agreement will feel safe. Consistency doesn't mean refusing to change course when needed. It means communicating those changes clearly, justifying them rationally, and applying them with fairness. Stability, in this sense, is a form of strength because it reassures your partners that today's deal won't be tomorrow's trap. Finally, rebuilding requires vision, a recognition that in the 21st century, prosperity is not built in isolation but in networks. The great economic powers of the modern era are not those who wall themselves off, but those who weave themselves so deeply into the global fabric that their absence becomes unthinkable. For the US, that means seeing India not just as a market to be leveraged, but as a co-architect in the shaping of global trade norms, technology standards, and supply chain resilience. If there's a lesson in the collapse, it's that breaking is always easier than building. The cost of hostility is not just in what it destroys, but in the decades it takes to repair. The future will belong to those who understand that every bridge burned must someday be rebuilt, and that the smartest leaders are the ones who choose to keep their bridges standing in the first place.